It started with a seat, not a throne in a grand cathedral, not a pulpit in the Vatican, but a first-class seat on a commercial airline. Most of the world didn't know who Father Leo was back then, just a quiet, sharply dressed priest with eyes that saw deeper than most. But one moment, one insult, would reveal the quiet power within him. And from that moment on, the world would begin to whisper his name, Leo XIV. The airport was humming with its usual quiet chaos, an orchestra of rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, and the distant rumble of jets preparing for flight. Among the stream of passengers moving through the first-class boarding gate was a tall, slender man in his early 50s. He wore a simple black cassock with a white clerical collar and carried only a worn leather satchel. His passport read Father Leo Benedicto, but he moved like a man who had never cared for titles or attention. The airline staff barely gave him a second glance. He didn't demand it. In fact, he seemed almost too quiet to belong in the glossy world of luxury travel. But Father Leo wasn't flying first class for prestige. A generous benefactor had purchased the ticket for him. A former student who had insisted on giving back in the only way he could. Father Leo accepted the gift with a polite smile, knowing he'd have preferred the back row near the bathrooms if it meant less fanfare. As he stepped into the cabin, the scent of leather seats, expensive cologne, and freshly poured champagne filled the air. He looked briefly at the passengers already seated, most buried in their phones, some adjusting their tailored suits, others eyeing him with brief curiosity before returning to their devices. Father Leo approached seat 1A, window seat, nearest to the front, the kind of seat reserved for CEOs, politicians, or celebrities. But someone was already in it. A man in his late 40s, with slicked back silver hair, a gleaming Rolex, and the self-assurance of someone who had never been told no without a lawsuit following. Father Leo stopped beside the man, gently cleared his throat and said, "Excuse me, sir. I believe this is my seat." The man didn't look up immediately. He was mid-text, chuckling to himself. Then he glanced at Leo, frowned and shook his head. "No, it's mine," the man replied curtly. 1A. Father Leo, still smiling, held up his boarding pass. "Forgive me, it appears we both have the same seat." That was when it happened. The shift. The moment when something so small revealed so much. The man snatched the boarding pass from Leo's hand and looked at it with exaggerated annoyance. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered. "I checked in first. No way some priest gets priority over me." The word priest hung in the air like an accusation. Nearby passengers turned their heads. A few leaned in, sensing something worth watching. First class rarely offered this kind of entertainment. A flight attendant hurried over, smiling too hard. "Gentlemen, is there a problem?" "This man," the executive said, gesturing with a dismissive wave, "is sitting in my seat." The attendant looked at both boarding passes, her smile faltering. "Oh, I see. It looks like there was a duplicate issue during check-in. You were both assigned 1A. I'll need to speak with the gate." The executive scoffed and crossed his arms. "I don't have time for this. Just move him. He looks like he belongs in coach anyway." There was a pause. Silence is a strange thing. Sometimes it's empty. Other times it's loaded with power. In that moment, the silence that followed was not one of submission, but restraint. The kind of silence that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. Father Leo said nothing for a moment. He simply looked at the man, not with anger, not even pity, but something deeper. A kind of quiet recognition, as if he had seen this man before, not his face, but the shape of his soul. A soul ruled by the illusion of importance. Finally, Leo spoke. "If it brings you peace, please," he said softly, "please keep the seat." The executive blinked. It wasn't the response he expected. It unsettled him. The way a shout could be dismissed with indifference. But kindness stuck. "I don't need peace, peace," the man said, louder now. "I need my seat." But the damage was done, or perhaps the healing had begun. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. "Father," she said, lowering her voice, "you are entirely within your rights. We'll find a resolution." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Father Leo replied gently. "I've flown in worse places." Passengers started whispering. "Did you hear what he said? He just gave up his seat? Who is he?" One woman, sitting in 2D, discreetly began filming with her phone, capturing the entire exchange. Not because she thought it would go viral, but because it felt important, real. Like witnessing something ancient in the middle of something so artificial. Eventually, the airline resolved the issue, upgraded the executive's ticket to a different seat, allowing Father Leo to remain in 1A. But that was no longer the story. The story was the man who didn't fight for comfort, the man who had every right to be outraged and instead offered peace. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a strange calm settled in the cabin. The usual jostling, the chatter, the complaints about overhead space, all of it dimmed. People watched Father Leo not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He simply sat down, folded his hands, and looked out the window, as if the clouds had something important to say. The engines rumbled beneath the plane as it began taxiing down the runway. But inside the cabin, something quieter was happening. Something invisible, yet deeply felt. It began with unease. The kind of discomfort that doesn't come from turbulence or cramped seats, but from witnessing something you don't fully understand. A handful of first-class passengers exchanged glances, not with judgment, but with a kind of silent questioning. Why hadn't the priest argued? Why hadn't he defended his seat, his dignity, his place? And why did it feel like he had walked away the victor? The man who had tried to eject Father Leo from his rightful seat sat a few rows back now, stiff and irritated. He pulled out his laptop and began typing furiously, pretending to be immersed in business. But every so often, his eyes drifted forward to seat 1A, where the priest sat motionless, back straight, hands resting calmly in his lap. There was no smugness on Father Leo's face, no smirk of moral superiority, only stillness, a kind of practiced, effortless peace that radiated beyond the confines of his own body. He wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't performing. He was simply being. And that unsettled people far more than any act of defiance ever could. A flight attendant approached him midway through the initial ascent. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with the fragile enthusiasm of someone still new to customer service. She leaned in and whispered, "Father, I'm so sorry about earlier. That man was way out of line." Father Leo turned to her, his eyes kind and warm. "Thank you, my child. but there's no harm done. She bit her lip. Still, I feel bad. If you'd like a complimentary drink, or a different meal, or... He raised a hand gently. Nothing is needed, truly. She lingered a moment longer, then nodded and walked away, but she didn't go far. She stood near the galley, watching him in quiet fascination, as if trying to understand how someone could be so untouchable by ego. Further back, a couple in their 60s was whispering. He didn't even blink when that man insulted him. I know. He just offered him the seat. Who does that? He didn't just offer it. He offered it like he meant it. Like it didn't matter at all. And that was precisely it. Father Leo's power came not from what he said, but from what didn't matter to him. The seat didn't matter. The insult didn't matter. His pride didn't need defending. He didn't just talk about humility. He lived it. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the plane hit a patch of rough air. It jolted sharply, causing several passengers to gasp. A glass clinked to the floor. The executive who had argued with Leo cursed under his breath and gripped the armrest tightly. The lights flickered for a moment. In the middle of it all, a little girl in row 2 began to cry. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Her mother tried to soothe her, but the child was inconsolable, her small body trembling with fear, tears streaking down her face. Father Leo stood slowly, ignoring the fastened seatbelt sign. Without a word, he moved to kneel beside the girl. The cabin crew noticed, but said nothing. Somehow, it felt wrong to interrupt. Father Leo placed his hand gently on the child's arm and looked into her eyes. Not with amusement or dismissal, but with complete presence. "You're safe," he said softly. "Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Just one." She did. "Now another." "That's it. You're doing well." The girl sniffled. Her breathing slowed. Within moments the tears stopped. The cabin, which had been vibrating with anxiety just seconds earlier, grew quiet again. Not because the turbulence had ceased. It hadn't. But because something stronger than fear had entered the room. A calm had taken root. A businessman in 3C lowered his newspaper. The woman filming in 2D teared up. And even the executive in the back, who had been watching the scene unfold in silent disbelief, felt something stir within him. Something old. Something inconvenient. Something that sounded annoyingly like shame. Father Leo returned to his seat without fanfare. He didn't look around to see who had noticed. He didn't acknowledge the grateful smile from the mother or the soft clapping from one of the flight attendants. He simply sat down, closed his eyes, and began to pray. Not with desperation, but with devotion, as though nothing on earth could touch the sanctuary he carried within himself. To those around him, it was clear. This wasn't just a man of God. This was a man who had mastered the art of responding, not reacting, of choosing stillness when the world expected anger, of carrying himself as if every moment were holy. No one said it aloud, but many thought the same thing, all at once. There's something different about him. And though the plane flew thousands of feet above the earth, in that quiet, pressurized capsule of human souls, something higher was happening. Not a miracle, not magic, just the unmistakable presence of a man who had already learned how to reign, not over others, but over himself. The hours passed, and the aircraft continued its steady course toward Rome, slicing through the sky as passengers slowly settled into the rhythm of long-haul travel. Meals had been served, movies began to play, and the lights inside the cabin dimmed to a soft golden hue. For many, it was a time to relax, for others to sleep. But for the passengers of this particular flight, especially those seated closest to the front, rest came second to curiosity. Father Leo had become the quiet gravity at the centre of the cabin. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not move unless necessary. Yet nearly every passenger in the first-class cabin found their gaze returning to him at least once, as though checking whether what they'd witnessed earlier had been real. He was still there, still. His eyes were closed, not in sleep, but in contemplation. One hand gently held a small wooden rosary, its beads worn smooth by years of prayer. The other rested lightly on the armrest, fingers relaxed. He breathed slowly, deeply, without tension. Not as if he were waiting for time to pass, but as if he were savouring each second as a gift. Across the aisle, a woman in a tailored navy dress leaned toward her husband. "He's been like that for an hour," she whispered. "Not reading, not sleeping, just there." Her husband, a lawyer from Chicago with a mind trained to dissect the motives of others, nodded slowly. "He doesn't need to do anything," he replied. "It's like he knows something we don't." Further back, the businessman in row 3C, who had been annoyed by nearly everything at the start of the flight, from the temperature to the wine selection, found himself staring at Father Leo with a strange combination of suspicion and admiration. He pulled out his phone and began to search the name on the passenger list he had sneakily glimpsed earlier: Father Leo Benedicto. But there were no articles, no viral videos, no flashy biographies, just a few scattered mentions in obscure theological journals, a couple of interviews buried in quiet corners of the internet, and one old photo of him standing ankle-deep in floodwaters, handing food to displaced villagers in a ruined village somewhere in Southeast Asia. No controversy, no drama, just service. The man put his phone down. Something about this priest made him feel small, but not in a belittling way, in a revealing way, like looking into a mirror and seeing what you had become. As if reading the room, a young man across the aisle, barely in his 20s, restless and fidgety since boarding, finally broke the silence. He leaned forward and asked with a kind of hesitant reverence, "Father, do you mind if I ask you something?" Father Leo opened his eyes and turned, the corners of his mouth lifting in a soft, inviting smile. "Of course." The young man paused. "How do you stay so calm, even when that guy was shouting at you earlier? You didn't flinch. I would have lost it." Leo looked at him, not as a teacher might look at a student, but as an equal. "Most people believe calm is the absence of conflict," he said, "but that's not true. Calm is not what's around you, it's what's within you. The world can scream, but if your heart doesn't echo it, peace remains." The words hung in the air, and several nearby passengers paused what they were doing. Even the executive, pretending to watch a financial news program on the small screen embedded in his seat, lowered the volume and listened. The young man blinked. "How did you learn that?" Leo took a long breath before answering. "Years ago, I lived in a village that flooded every monsoon season. We had no warning systems. the water would rise in the night, and we'd wake to see our homes swallowed. At first I fought it. I shouted, I begged, but the water came anyway. He paused. Eventually, I stopped shouting. I learnt to move with the water, to carry the children on my back, to wade through the uncertainty with faith, not fear. I learned that the world doesn't obey us, but peace listens to those who are silent. A flight attendant, who had just finished collecting trays from the dinner service, stopped and turned to face him fully. "Were you a missionary?" she asked. "In a way," he replied, "but mostly I just listened. That's what most people need, to be heard, not fixed." A gentle chuckle rippled through the nearby seats. The atmosphere had shifted again. The flight, once a sterile corporate cocoon of luxury travel, now felt more like a chapel at 30,000 feet. Its walls held together not by rivets and steel, but by shared humanity. People began to talk more freely, asking Father Leo small questions about life, about God, about suffering, even about what books he read. His answers were always short, never preachy, and sometimes followed by a thoughtful pause that left room for the listener to fill with their own reflection. One man, a hardened investor travelling to Italy for a high-stakes deal, suddenly found himself confessing, not sins, but fears. "I'm terrified of failing," he admitted quietly, "not because of the money, but because I don't know who I'll be without the title, without the deals, without the game." Father Leo looked at him and said, "Then perhaps the failure you fear is actually the door to who you really are." That sentence didn't fix the man, but it unlocked something. Nearby, the little girl who had cried during turbulence earlier was now drawing with crayons. At some point, she had moved closer to Leo and placed one of her pictures, a clumsy drawing of clouds and a sun, on his lap. He had thanked her with such sincerity that she glowed with pride for the rest of the flight. The mood was unmistakable now. Something had happened on this flight, something no one could name. A disturbance in the ordinary, a quiet sanctification of space. People weren't checking their watches. They weren't reaching for headphones. They were sitting straighter, speaking softer, and listening more. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a crew member whispered to another, "He's not just a priest. He's different." The reply came quickly. "Yeah, I think we're flying with someone important." But it wasn't the fame of the Vatican that made him important. Not the robes or the rituals. It was this. He made people feel seen. And in seeing themselves through his stillness, they began to change. He had noticed the priest the moment he stepped on the plane, not because of the collar, or the cassock, or even the odd moment with the seat dispute, though that had certainly caught his attention. It was something else, something unspoken, a current, quiet and unseen, that moved through the cabin and pulled at something deep within him. Cardinal Antonio Lucchesi was a man who rarely missed anything. His life had been built on watching people when they thought no one was looking. As a diplomat, then a bishop, and eventually as a trusted advisor within the Curia, he had spent his career reading faces like scripture and silences like secrets, but in all his years, he had never quite encountered someone like Father Leo Benedicto. At first, Lucchesi did what he always did. He observed. From his seat in 3C, he watched the unfolding drama with the business executive and the seat mix-up. He had expected the priest to back down with quiet discomfort, or perhaps insist on his rightful seat with soft authority. What he hadn't expected was the pure, unaffected humility, genuine, not performative. The cardinal didn't react, but inside, something shifted. He had seen countless men of the cloth adopt a mask of humility when it suited their purpose. Some wore it like a robe, others used it as armour. But this wasn't that. This was something deeper, something disturbingly rare. As the flight wore on, Lucchese kept his eyes on the priest, not in suspicion, but in fascination. He watched how Father Leo moved with almost imperceptible grace, never fidgeting, never restless. His gestures were economical, but full of meaning. Every word he spoke seemed chosen with care, not calculation. Lucchese noticed how people were drawn to him, how they leaned toward him without realizing, how their voices softened when they addressed him. The young man, the frightened child, even the bitter executive who had since gone completely silent. Each had been disarmed, not by argument, but by presence. The cardinal had seen spiritual charisma before. It wasn't new to him. But this wasn't mere charisma. It was weight. Leo carried something old, something holy. He began to reflect. The church was at a crossroads, and everyone in Rome knew it. Scandal had shaken its foundation. Politics polluted its air. The faithful were drifting. Bishops whispered, alliances formed, and the question grew louder every year, who will lead next? Lucchese had seen the candidates, dozens of them, men with sharp intellects, powerful sermons, all taught sermons and polished reputations. But none had made him pause like this unknown priest from the edges of the church. He reached for his tablet and began to type a message. Not because he had decided anything, but because he knew what his instincts were telling him. Years in the Vatican had taught him to trust silence over speeches, eyes over documents, and souls over resumes. To Ser Monsignor Paolo Rinaldi. Subject, potential candidate. Body, there's a priest on my flight. Name, Father Leo Benedicto. I suspect he serves somewhere in the global south, though I haven't confirmed it yet. Unknown to most. But I want you to take note of him. Not for what he says, but for what happens around him. The cabin has changed since he boarded, and not in ways that can be orchestrated. He has no idea people are watching, and that may be the most important thing about him. He paused, reread the message, and hovered over the send button. Then he added one final line. If the church is to survive what comes next, it may need someone who is not trying to lead, but is already quietly doing so. He pressed send. The message bounced through satellites as the plane crossed the Atlantic. Below them, the world moved on unaware. Nations, cities, empires unaware that a single email, sparked by a single quiet presence, was beginning to light a fuse in the shadows of Rome. Lucchese sat back and watched Father Leo help a steward with his tray. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet act of a man who instinctively reached for the burden of another. The cardinal smiled, a rare, sincere thing that softened the lines in his face. He knew the politics ahead would be brutal, the manoeuvring relentless. But somewhere deep in his bones, he also knew this. A storm was coming, The church would not survive it with strong fists or loud voices. It would need something stronger. A man who did not seek the seat. A man who would give it up without resentment. A man who, when insulted publicly, responded not with outrage, but with grace. A man like Leo. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he prayed not for clarity, but for courage. Courage to follow the stillness. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang with an ancient echo that pulsed through the narrow Roman streets, setting pigeons into flight and drawing the attention of tourists and locals alike. The square outside the Vatican was already packed. Hundreds of thousands of faithful and curious onlookers crammed shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the balcony above. It had been a long conclave, days of locked doors and whispered prayers. The world had waited. The cardinals had debated, and then the smoke, white. When the plume rose from the Sistine Chapel chimney, a collective breath was held across the globe. Eyes turned toward televisions. News anchors scrambled for updates. The faithful wept in anticipation, while skeptics raised eyebrows. Who had they chosen this time? No one outside the College of Cardinals knew the name. Not yet. Inside the Grand Vatican corridors, behind the gilded walls and frescoed ceilings, a pair of crimson doors opened slowly. The new pope emerged, not in regal stride, but with the quiet footfalls of a man still surprised by the weight on his shoulders. There were whispers. Some cardinals smiled softly. Others watched him with a reverence that came not from politics, but from recognition. They had seen something, and now the world would see it too. As he stepped into the blinding light of the balcony, the crowd hushed. Cameras zoomed in. For a moment, the enormity of it all was swallowed by silence. He looked over the sea of faces, not as a ruler surveying his subjects, but as a shepherd seeing each soul individually. He raised his hand slowly, not with theatrical drama, but with sincerity. His voice, when it came, was gentle but unwavering. Fratelli e sorelle, brothers and sisters. It wasn't the words that moved people, it was the way he said them, like he meant it, like he already knew each one of them. We have been given this moment together, not for power, but for healing. His Italian was unpolished, his cadence humble. There was no grand declaration, no self-important sermon, just a man standing in robes he had never asked for, speaking with the weightless gravity of someone who had nothing to prove. And then came the name, Pope Leo XIV. At first it didn't register. The press corps scrambled to confirm it. Vatican reporters whispered in disbelief. Even among the clergy there were startled glances. Who? There was almost no media footprint. No best-selling theological treatise. No viral videos or charismatic speeches. Just scattered references in dusty diocesan newsletters. A handful of obscure humanitarian photos, and one widely shared but anonymously posted video from a plane, where a priest had offered his seat, calmed a crying child, and answered questions not with dominance, but with stillness. It was that video that now resurfaced, spreading like wildfire across social media platforms. This is him. This is Pope Leo XIV. I was on that flight. Passengers began speaking to the press. They described the strange calm they had felt, the silence that had replaced anxiety, the conversations that had turned into confessions. The priest who had never once introduced himself as anything more than Father Leo. And now, they realised, they had been flying beside a future pope, one whose holiness had announced itself not with pageantry, but with presence. The executive who had insulted him. He declined to speak to the press, but he reportedly wept in private after watching the balcony announcements. Those who knew him said he became quieter after that flight, more patient with his staff, more generous with his time. He didn't understand exactly what had happened, but he knew he had stood face to face with a man he could not diminish. The flight attendant who had served Leo that day was invited to speak on a popular talk show. "He looked at me like I mattered," she said, holding back tears. "I've served 1,000 first-class passengers, but he's the only one who ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible." And the Cardinal in 3C? He never took credit, never mentioned the email. He simply smiled when asked what he thought of the new Pope and replied, "The Holy Spirit speaks in stillness. Some of us were just listening." Back in Rome, the transformation began almost immediately. Leo refused the traditional golden cross and chose a simple wooden one carved by orphans in the Philippines. He asked for the papal palace to be open to refugees at night. He insisted that every Vatican office plant at least one olive tree somewhere in the world for peace to take root. But it wasn't just symbolic. The world noticed. The disillusioned returned. Not to rituals, but to meaning. Not to institutions, but to something sacred that had long been obscured by grandeur. Letters poured into the Vatican. Not from dignitaries, but from nurses, construction workers, prisoners and children. People who had never written to a pope before. People who said they didn't believe in God, but now, maybe they weren't so sure. And in a quiet chapel late one night, Pope Leo IV knelt alone in prayer. There was no press, no audience, just him, the silence, and the same rosary he had held on that flight. He prayed not for greatness, but for grace, not for strength, but for the strength to remain small in a world that demanded he become large. He knew the weight of history. He knew what came with the name he now bore. But he also knew what had brought him here. It was not ambition, not theology, not strategy. It was a moment on a plane. A moment when the world expected ego, and he offered empathy. A moment when insult met immovability and lost. A moment when, without anyone knowing it, a man gave up his seat and walked into destiny.